The twin moons of Arceus hung low in the sky, their pale light spilling over the jagged, lifeless terrain like the watchful eyes of some distant, uncaring deity. Beneath their cold gaze, Jack Carter adjusted his oxygen mask and stepped cautiously across the uneven ground. The air here was thin, tinged with a metallic sharpness that stung his lungs despite the filtration system. This was a dead world, stripped of its secrets by scavengers and centuries alike. At least, that's what everyone believed. Jack's client, an anonymous corporate exec with deep pockets and deeper paranoia, thought otherwise. The promise of a hefty payday had brought him to this forsaken rock, with only vague coordinates and the directive to retrieve artifacts of significant value. No further details, of course. There never were with these types. They trusted you to figure it out or die trying. As he moved deeper into the terrain, Jack felt the eerie silence pressing in, amplifying every crunch of gravel under his boots, every rasp of his breath. This wasn't his first run on a desolate planet, but there was something about this place that sat wrong with him. Too quiet, too still. The signal ping on his wrist console had led him here, to a sheer cliff face marred with unnatural markings. Alien script, faint and weathered, stretched across the surface in erratic lines, glowing faintly when his light passed over them. He didn't recognize the language, but he'd seen enough ruins to know it predated most recorded civilizations. The markings pulsed faintly now, responding to his proximity. His unease deepened. Jack exhaled, rubbing a gloved hand over his unshaven jaw. "All right, let's see what you've got," he muttered, unshouldering his plasma torch. The beams sliced cleanly through a fissure in the cliffside, revealing a narrow crevice that spiraled down into blackness. As the last chunk of stone fell away, the smell hit him, a mix of rust, decay, and something acrid that burned his nostrils. He leaned into the darkness, the faint glow of his helmet light illuminating what appeared to be an ancient corridor carved into the rock. The walls shimmered faintly with veins of an unknown mineral, pulsing as though alive. Jack hesitated. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. He'd faced worse odds in his mercenary career, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just another ruin. This was something wrong. With a grim shake of his head, he squeezed through the crevice, descending cautiously. The shaft narrowed and twisted, forcing him to crawl at points, the weight of the planet pressing down on him. His breath came heavier now, his heart pounding louder in his ears. He didn't notice the first scream at first, faint and distant, like wind slipping through a hollow. But as he descended further, the sound grew sharper, piercing. It wasn't human. Jack froze, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But curiosity and the promise of the payout held him in place. He pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth. The screams became more frequent, more distinct. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, rising and falling in a cadence that clawed at his nerves. It wasn't pain alone, it was despair, raw and unrelenting. Finally, he reached the chamber. The space was vast and circular, the walls lined with towering skeletal columns that seemed to hum faintly. At the center, bathed in an unnatural glow, stood a cage. It wasn't a crude iron structure. It was sleek, almost organic, its bars pulsating with a faint blue light. Inside, a figure huddled. At first, Jack thought it was a child. Small, frail, with thin limbs and a body curled tightly in on itself. But as the figure stirred, its skin caught the light, a deep, luminous blue, etched with patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer. The alien girl looked up, her eyes locking onto his. They weren't the wide, terrified eyes he'd expected. They were fierce, piercing, filled with a sorrow that felt older than the ruins themselves. She opened her mouth, and the scream came again, raw and desperate. Jack staggered back, his hands instinctively going to his ears. But the sound wasn't external. It was inside his head, ricocheting through his skull. "Stop!" he barked, his voice echoing in the chamber. To his surprise, the sound ceased. The girl's lips moved, forming words in a language he didn't recognize. But he didn't need a translator to understand the plea in her tone. the desperation in her trembling hands as they gripped the cage bars. His wrist console beeped, a sharp, insistent alarm. Jack glanced down and his blood ran cold. Cartel signals close and closing in fast. "Damn it," he muttered, his gaze darting between the girl and the corridor he'd entered through. He had no idea what she was, why she was here, or what the cartel wanted with her. But leaving her was out of the question. The girl's eyes widened as he approached, her hands instinctively pulling back. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. He knelt beside the cage, examining its structure. No visible lock, no seams. "Let's get you out of here." The girl flinched as his hands neared the bars, but the cage responded, the glow flickering as though unsure of itself. "Yeah, not normal tech," Jack muttered, pulling a small device from his belt. A low-frequency disruptor. Not much, but it might buy him time. As he worked, the girl's voice came again, softer this time. The words weren't screams, but something else. Something that tugged at a part of him he thought long dead. The disruptor buzzed, the cage shimmered, and then, with a sound like cracking ice, the bars dissolved. The girl collapsed into his arms, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Come on," Jack said, hoisting her gently. "We've got to move." As the cartel's heavy boots echoed down the corridor, Jack felt a strange certainty settle over him. He hadn't just stumbled onto a mission, he'd stumbled into something far bigger, far darker, and it wasn't going to let him go. The landscape outside the ruins was a monochrome wasteland, cast in muted grays by the twin moons overhead. Jack Carter staggered across the rocky plain, the alien girl slumped against his chest. Her weight was negligible, her thin frame fragile, as though she might crumble to dust at any moment. But there was strength in her grip. Her small hands clung tightly to his jacket, her breath shallow but steady against his shoulder. Behind him, the cartel's pursuit grew closer. Their lights were distant specks now, glimmering in the gloom like predatory eyes. But Jack knew better than to rely on distance. They were methodical, relentless. They'd track his trail, scouring the planet inch by inch until they found him, or what was left of him. The girl stirred in his arms, her luminous eyes flickering open for a moment before slipping shut again. Jack glanced down at her, unease tightening his chest. Whatever she wasn't just some random captive. The cage, the screams, the cartel's presence, none of it added up. "You better be worth it, kid," he muttered, his voice low, his breath fogging in the cold air. The terrain grew harsher, forcing Jack to slow. Razor-sharp ridges of obsidian jutted from the ground, forming a natural labyrinth. Each step was a gamble, the loose rocks threatening to betray his position with every shift. He stopped briefly to catch his breath, propping the girl against a boulder. She didn't wake, but her breathing grew steadier, the rise and fall of her chest faintly glowing in the darkness. Jack crouched beside her, pulling out his wrist console. The display flickered, his oxygen levels dipping precariously. His ship wasn't far, a few kilometers at most, but the cartel had sabotaged him before. He couldn't assume it was still operational. The soft whir of engines reached him, faint but unmistakable. Jack's pulse quickened. He dimmed his console and ducked lower, scanning the horizon. There, a sleek, black scout ship gliding silently above the terrain, its undercarriage bristling with sensor arrays. Jack cursed under his breath. The cartel wasn't just searching, they were hunting. The girl shifted, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Jack turned to her, his hand instinctively going to her shoulder. "Hey," he whispered. "Stay quiet, all right? They're close." Her eyes opened again, wide and glowing faintly in the darkness. For a moment she stared at him, uncomprehending. Then she spoke, her voice weak but urgent, the alien syllables tumbling out like a rushing stream. Jack shook his head. "I don't understand. Look, I'll get you out of here, but you've got to trust me." She cut him off, her voice sharp now, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. The words meant nothing, but the desperation behind them was clear. Then he heard it, a sound like static, faint but insistent, creeping into the edges of his mind. It wasn't audible, not in the way normal sound was, but it was there, a presence pressing against his thoughts. Jack staggered, his vision swimming. The girl's eyes locked onto his, her expression frantic, as though she could see the struggle playing out inside him. "Stop it," he hissed, clutching his head. "Whatever you're doing, stop." The pressure eased, but the static lingered, faint and buzzing at the edge of his perception. The girl slumped back, exhaustion etched across her features. Jack took a steadying breath, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Okay," he muttered, more to himself than her. "You're full of surprises, but right now we've got bigger problems." The scout ship was circling back, its searchlights sweeping over the labyrinthine terrain. Jack scooped the girl into his arms and began moving again, his pace quickening despite the protest in his muscles. The ground sloped downward, leading to a narrow crevice that opened into a shallow cave. Jack ducked inside, pressing his back against the cool stone. The girl lay motionless beside him, her faint glow dimming as she drifted into unconsciousness again. The ship passed overhead, its engines thrumming ominously. Jack held his breath, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his hip. Not that it would do much good against cartel tech, but the weight of it was comforting nonetheless. Minutes stretched into an eternity before the ship's lights faded into the distance. Jack exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping with relief. "You're going to get me killed," he muttered, glancing at the girl. She didn't respond, of course, but her stillness was unnerving. Jack crouched beside her, his fingers brushing her neck to check for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. He pulled a small canister from his pack, spraying a regenerative mist over the cuts and bruises marring her skin. The wounds were shallow, but there were too many of them. Torture, he thought grimly. They wanted something from her. But what? Jack leaned back, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. He needed answers, but every question only seemed to lead to more questions. Why had the cartel come to this planet? What was so important about this girl that they'd tear the place apart to find her? And why, of all the mercenaries they could have hired, had his client chosen him for this job? The girl stirred again, her glowing eyes fluttering open. This time her gaze was clearer, more focused. She looked at Jack, her lips moving, the alien words soft but deliberate. I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. She frowned, her brow furrowing as though in thought. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his temple. The static returned, sharper this time, but with it came clarity. Images, fleeting and fragmented, flooded Jack's mind. A city of crystal towers, shimmering under twin suns. A great exodus, ships fleeing into the void as shadows consumed the stars. And a weapon, vast, incomprehensible, its energy pulsing with an ominous rhythm. Jack recoiled, his breath ragged. The connection broke and the girl's hand fell away. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice trembling with equal parts fear and anger. The girl didn't answer, but her eyes held his, unyielding. Jack shook his head, forcing himself to focus. The cartel was still out there, and the static in his mind told him this was far from over. Whatever this girl was, whatever she carried, it was something no one was supposed to have. And now, it was his problem. The morning on Arceus came slowly, if it came at all. The twin moons receded reluctantly, their pale light giving way to a faint golden haze that painted the desolate terrain in muted shades of amber. Jack Carter emerged from the cave, his steps cautious, his senses alert. The alien girl followed close behind, her gait unsteady but improving, her glowing blue skin muted in the half-light. They had walked for hours in silence, navigating the treacherous ridges and sharp outcroppings that seemed to rise endlessly out of the ground. The cartel's search had gone quiet, or so it seemed. Jack knew better than to trust silence. It was the kind of quiet that came before an ambush, before the killing blow. The girl had said little, and Jack had asked less. Every glance she cast over her shoulder, every tremor in her voice, spoke of fear. But there was something else, too. A resolute determination, a thread of steel beneath the fragility. She wasn't running aimlessly. She was leading him somewhere. Jack tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his shoulder, his jaw set. "We need to stop," he said, his voice low. The girl turned, her glowing eyes questioning. "Just for a minute," he added, gesturing toward a cluster of jagged boulders. "We need cover, and I need to know where the hell we're going." She hesitated but nodded, following him into the rocky enclave. Jack dropped his pack to the ground, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. "All right," he said, crouching to face her. "You've been steering us this whole time. I think it's time you filled me in. What are we heading toward?" The girl met his gaze, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. She touched her chest lightly. "Lysa," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jack blinked. "That your name?" She nodded. "Lysa," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "All right, Lysa, I'm Jack." She tilted her head as if she already knew. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You've got to give me more than that. I saw something back there. When you touched my head, what was it?" Lysa hesitated, her gaze flickering to the horizon as if she feared the shadows themselves. She pressed her palm to the ground, and Jack felt a faint vibration beneath his boots. The dust between them began to swirl, forming shapes, a city with crystalline spires, identical to the one Jack had glimpsed in the vision. "That's where you're from?" Jack asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, then extended her hand again, the swirling dust reforming. This time, the image was darker, ships tearing through space, a great shadow pursuing them. Jack's stomach turned as the dust coalesced into the shape of the weapon he'd seen before, its lines sharp, its energy pulsing with an almost living malevolence. Lysa spoke then, her words halting and fragmented, but Jack caught enough to piece it together. "Cartel. Take. Destroy." She pointed at the weapon. "Worlds." Jack leaned back, his pulse quickening. "That thing's real? It's a weapon?" Lysa nodded again, her expression grim. Jack swore under his breath, his mind racing. He'd thought this was a simple retrieval job, a payday. Instead, he was caught up in something that could wipe out entire planets. "And you," he said, his voice low, "you know how to stop it." She hesitated, her glowing eyes clouding with doubt. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Jack stared at her, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. "You don't know." Lysa's gaze dropped to the ground, her shoulders slumping. Jack sighed, scrubbing a hand down his face. "Great. So we're running blind, carrying the one thing every warlord and criminal syndicate in the galaxy would kill to get their hands on." Lysa looked up sharply, her expression shifting. She touched her temple, then pointed to his. "No," Jack said, holding up a hand. "We're not doing that again. Last time, I saw enough to give me nightmares for a year." But Lysa was insistent, her gestures more urgent now. She pressed her hand against his temple, and before Jack could stop her, the connection flared to life. The static returned, sharper and louder than before, but with it came clarity. He saw Lysa's people, brilliant and serene, their crystalline cities thriving in harmony with their environment. He saw their exile, their worlds consumed by war and betrayal. And then he saw her, locked in the cage, her mind torn open by the cartel's relentless interrogation. They hadn't found what they were looking for, but Lysa had. The image shifted, and Jack saw the ruins he'd stumbled upon. Beneath the surface, hidden within the labyrinth, was something ancient and alive, a remnant of her people's knowledge. A key. Jack gasped, breaking the connection, his head pounding. He staggered back, clutching his temples. "You're leading me back there," he said, realization dawning. "That's why you didn't run farther. You need what's in that ruin." Lysa nodded, her expression both apologetic and resolute. Jack laughed bitterly. "You've got to be kidding me. You're telling me we've been running away from the cartel, only to head right back into their laps? Lisa didn't answer, but the determination in her eyes said enough. Jack cursed, pacing in the small clearing. This is insane. They'll have the place locked down by now. Lisa stood, her small frame seeming to grow taller despite her frailty. She pointed to the ruin, then to herself, then to Jack. You really think we can do this? Jack asked, his tone incredulous. She didn't hesitate. Jack exhaled, shaking his head. All right, he said finally, but if this gets us killed, I'm blaming you. Lisa's lips quirked in what might have been the faintest hint of a smile. The sound of engines shattered the moment. Jack's head snapped up, his rifle at the ready. The cartel's scout ship was back, its searchlight sweeping over the terrain. Move, Jack hissed, grabbing Lisa's arm and pulling her into the shadows. The stakes had just risen, and Jack knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay beneath that ruin, it wasn't just their best chance. It was their only chance. The ruins of the ancient city loomed ahead, their crystalline spires broken and blackened, reaching into the sky like jagged claws. Jack Carter crouched behind a crumbled pillar, his pulse pounding in his ears. Lisa huddled beside him, her luminous skin casting faint shadows across the shattered ground. Above them, the cartel's scout ship hovered ominously, its searchlights probing the labyrinth of ruins. Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, his thoughts a tangle of plans and doubts. Returning here had felt like madness. Now it felt like suicide. Lisa tugged at his sleeve, her glowing eyes locked onto his. She pointed to a narrow fissure in the ground, partially hidden by the rubble. Jack followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. That's where you need to go? He whispered. She nodded, her expression grim. Jack exhaled slowly. And what's down there? Another vision? Another headache? Lisa pressed her hand to his chest, her touch surprisingly steady. Then she pointed to herself, her meaning clear. Trust me. Jack bit back a curse. Trust was a luxury he rarely afforded, but Lisa had dragged him this far, and something in her gaze, something raw and unyielding, convinced him to keep going. The scout ship's engines roared, the sound reverberating through the ruins. Jack ducked lower, pulling Lisa with him. The cartel was methodical, sweeping the area in a grid pattern. It was only a matter of time before they found the fissure, or stumbled across Jack and Lisa. We don't have much time, Jack muttered. He scanned the terrain, his sharp eyes noting the scout ship's movement. When I say go, you move fast. Understand? Lisa nodded, her glowing eyes unblinking. The ship's lights shifted, sweeping away from their position. Jack seized the moment. Now! They darted across the open ground, the jagged crystals crunching beneath their boots. Lisa reached the fissure first, slipping inside with a fluid grace that belied her frailty. Jack followed, his larger frame forcing him to move slower. The narrow passage descended sharply, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The walls of the fissure shimmered faintly, as though the crystals embedded in the rock retained a memory of the city's former brilliance. Lisa moved with purpose, her glowing skin blending with the faint light. Jack followed, his rifle raised, his every sense on high alert. Care to tell me what we're looking for? He asked, his voice low. Lisa glanced back, her lips pressing into a thin line. She pointed ahead, her hand trembling slightly. Jack frowned, but said nothing. The path widened into a cavern, the air thick with an energy Jack could feel in his bones. At the center of the chamber stood a massive structure, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and pulse in the dim light. Lisa approached it with reverence, her glowing hands tracing the patterns as though they were familiar. Jack hung back, his rifle sweeping the shadows. Any chance you can tell me what that is? He asked, his voice tight. Lisa turned to him, her expression a mixture of urgency and fear. She pointed to the structure, then to herself, then back to him. You need me for this? Jack asked, his stomach sinking. She nodded. Jack approached reluctantly, his every instinct screaming at him to keep his distance. But Lisa's eyes held his, steady and imploring. He placed a hand on the structure, its surface cool and alive beneath his touch. The cavern pulsed with light, and Jack's vision blurred. Images flooded his mind. Lisa's people, their voices raised in song as the structure hummed with energy. A great exodus, ships fleeing as shadows consumed the stars, and the weapon, massive and alive, its power spiraling out of control, tearing through worlds. Then came the cartel, their ships descending on the ruins like vultures. They had captured Lissa, their minds set on harnessing the weapon's power, but they had overlooked one thing. The key wasn't the weapon. It was her. Jack stumbled back, his breath ragged. The connection broke, leaving him reeling. Lissa caught his arm, her grip steady despite her trembling frame. "You're the key," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "The weapon needs you to work, or to stop it." Lissa nodded, her expression pained. Jack's mind raced. If the cartel got their hands on her, they'd unleash the weapon's power without hesitation. But to keep her safe meant destroying any chance of the cartel finding the weapon. "You knew this," he said, realization dawning. "You knew I'd have to make the call." Lissa didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Jack cursed under his breath. "Damn it, Lissa. I'm a mercenary, not a hero." She reached for his hand, her glowing fingers curling around his. Her eyes, bright with unspoken words, said enough. "You have to be." Before Jack could respond, the cavern shook, dust and debris raining down from above. The cartel had found them. "We're out of time," Jack said, his voice grim. Lissa gestured toward the structure, her movements urgent. She pointed to a glowing panel at its base, then to Jack. "You want me to activate it?" he asked, his stomach sinking further. She nodded, then pointed to herself, her meaning clear. "I'll handle the rest." Jack hesitated, his mind warring with itself. Activating the structure could destroy the weapon, or it could kill them both. But leaving it intact meant the cartel would win. His hand hovered over the panel, his heart pounding. "If this goes sideways," he said, glancing at Lissa, "you better have a damn good plan." She offered a faint smile, her glowing eyes steady. Jack exhaled, his fingers pressing the panel. The cavern erupted with light, the structure humming to life as the patterns pulsed in rhythmic waves. Lissa stepped forward, her hands raised, her body glowing brighter than ever. Above them, the cartel's engines roared, their shadows descending. Jack raised his rifle, his jaw set. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The cavern pulsed with energy, the hum of the ancient structure growing louder and deeper until it seemed to vibrate in Jack Carter's bones. Lissa stood before the crystalline core, her glowing hands outstretched, her figure bathed in light so bright it was nearly blinding. The patterns on the structure shifted faster now, aligning in ways Jack didn't understand but could feel. A rhythm of precision, a song without sound. Above them, the cartel's engines roared, the vibrations shaking loose shards of crystal from the cavern walls. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. He had little more than his instincts and dwindling ammunition against what was likely an entire strike team armed to the teeth. And Lissa... Jack turned his gaze to her, his chest tightening. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her body, so frail when he'd first found her, now seemed impossibly strong, her presence commanding. The fear that had shadowed her every movement was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. "Lissa," Jack said, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "What happens if you activate that thing? What happens to you?" She glanced back at him, her glowing eyes shimmering with sadness. She didn't need to speak for Jack to understand. "No," Jack said firmly, stepping closer. "There has to be another way. You can't—" A deafening explosion shook the cavern, cutting him off. The cartel had breached the fissure. Jack spun toward the sound, his rifle snapping to his shoulder. Shadows moved in the narrow passage, and then the first cartel enforcers poured into the chamber, their weapons raised. Jack fired, his shots precise and deadly. The first wave fell, but more followed, their numbers overwhelming. Jack ducked behind a jagged outcropping, returning fire as bolts of energy whizzed past him. "Lissa!" he shouted over the chaos. "We're out of time!" She turned back to the core, her hands trembling as she pressed them to its surface. The structure flared, its patterns locking into place with a finality that resonated through the chamber. The light enveloping Lissa grew brighter, almost unbearable. Jack squinted against it, his heart pounding. "Lysa, stop!" he shouted. "You don't have to do this." But she didn't stop. The cartel's reinforcements surged forward, their weapons blazing. Jack fired until his rifle clicked empty, then drew his sidearm, his jaw set in grim determination. "Come on, then," he snarled, stepping into the open. Before the cartel could overwhelm him, the cavern exploded with light. It wasn't an attack. It was something far more profound. The light swept through the chamber, its brilliance consuming everything in its path. Jack felt it wash over him, warm and gentle, like a wave of calm after a lifetime of storms. The cartel soldiers froze, their weapons falling from their hands. One by one they crumpled to the ground, unconscious but unharmed. Jack staggered, his vision swimming. The light began to fade, leaving the cavern eerily quiet. "Lisa?" he called, his voice hoarse. He turned toward the core, his heart sinking. Lisa stood motionless, her hands still pressed against the structure. Her glow had dimmed, her once luminous skin now pale and dull. "Lisa!" Jack ran to her, catching her as she collapsed. Her body was light in his arms, too light, as though the energy that had sustained her was gone. "Why?" Jack whispered, his voice breaking. Lisa's eyes fluttered open, her gaze meeting his. She raised a trembling hand, touching his chest. "You," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Safe." Jack shook his head, his throat tight. "You didn't have to do this. We could have found another way." She smiled faintly, her glowing eyes dimming. "No other way." Jack held her tighter, his mind racing. There had to be something he could do. But Lysa's breathing slowed, her body growing colder. "Lysa," he said, his voice firm. "Stay with me, don't—" The core pulsed one final time, its light fading to a soft glow. The cavern fell silent, the energy dissipating into the air. Jack lowered his head, his jaw clenched. Lysa's hand slipped from his chest, falling limp at her side. For a long moment, Jack sat there holding her lifeless body, the weight of his failure crushing him. But then, a faint glow returned to the core. Jack looked up, his brow furrowing. The patterns on the structure began to shift again, slower this time, their movements deliberate. A soft hum filled the air, and Lysa's body began to glow faintly. Jack stared, his breath catching. "Lysa?" he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, the faintest light returning to them. "You," she said weakly, her voice a fragile whisper. "Saved me." Jack's throat tightened. He didn't understand what had happened, but he didn't care. He held her close, relief flooding through him. The cartel soldiers remained unconscious, the cavern eerily still. Jack stood, cradling Lysa in his arms. "We're not staying to find out if they wake up," he muttered. Lysa managed a faint smile, her glow growing just a little brighter. As they emerged from the ruins into the fading light of Arcay's endless dusk, the cartel ship lay abandoned, its engines cold. Jack helped Lysa aboard, his movements careful. As the ship's engines roared to life, Jack glanced back at the ruins, their crystalline spires glinting faintly in the distance. He didn't know what the cartel would do when they returned, but for now, the weapon was beyond their reach, and Lysa was alive. As they left the desolate planet behind, Jack sat beside her, the ship's controls humming softly. "You're stuck with me now," he said, his tone light but sincere. Lysa smiled, her glow warm and steady. Jack leaned back in his seat, his gaze on the stars. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost: hope. The cantina smelled of burnt metal and stale spirits, the kind that left a permanent haze in the air. A holographic jukebox sputtered out a warped tune, its melody barely audible over the hum of conversation. The walls, patched with mismatched panels, seemed to lean inward as though they were eavesdropping on the secrets exchanged within. It was a place where no questions were asked, and the only currency that mattered was discretion. Jackson Drake sat at a corner booth, nursing a glass of something amber and biting. The drink wasn't for pleasure, it was a prop, a way to look occupied while his mind worked through the puzzle laid before him. His stubble-lined jaw twitched as he shifted in his seat, his leather jacket creaking with the motion. He wasn't used to staying still, but tonight was different. Tonight, he was waiting. Across the room, a group of scruffy miners argued over a game of cards. Their laughter was loud, forced, a poor attempt to mask the desperation that clung to this station like rust. On the far side of the bar, a trader with a cybernetic arm gestured wildly as he recounted tales of his latest haul, mostly junk salvaged from derelict ships, but every piece sold with the conviction of gold. Jackson's eyes weren't on any of them. His focus was on the comms device embedded in his wrist gauntlet, the screen flickering faintly under his sleeve. He tapped it idly, cycling through encrypted channels, listening for a signal he couldn't be sure would come. The message he'd received earlier still lingered in his mind, its cryptic simplicity gnawing at him. She needs you. Who was she? He'd dismissed it at first, chalking it up to some poorly aimed scam or a desperate plea for help from a stranger. But the encryption, that was no amateur's work. It was military grade, the kind Jackson hadn't encountered since his days in the Earth Coalition fleet, a lifetime ago. The thought made him scowl, his grip tightening on the glass. He'd buried that part of himself, or so he liked to believe. But the past had a way of clawing itself to the surface, and this message was proof of that. He leaned back, letting his gaze drift to the cantina's grimy viewport. Beyond it lay the void, a sprawling sea of stars and shadows, dotted with the occasional glimmer of distant ships. Somewhere out there, he knew, was the answer, and yet for the first time in years, Jackson hesitated. The bartender interrupted his thoughts, sliding a fresh glass onto the table. "On the house," the man said, his voice gravelly from years of breathing recycled air. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." Jackson offered a curt nod, ignoring the drink. "You hear anything about the Viridian bounty?" he asked casually, though his tone carried an edge. The bartender raised an eyebrow, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "You mean the princess?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Biggest bounty this side of the galaxy. Enough credits to buy your own moon, but no one's stupid enough to go after her." "Why not?" The man chuckled darkly. "Because it's suicide. Ravage Collective's got her locked up tight on some backwater moon. Fortress is impenetrable, guards are fanatics, and rumor has it—" He hesitated, lowering his voice further. "She's not just a hostage. They say she's got powers, dangerous ones, stuff even her own people don't understand." Jackson's jaw tightened. He didn't like rumors, but this one had a weight to it that made his skin prickle. He leaned forward. "What kind of powers?" The bartender shook his head. "No one knows, and no one wants to find out. Look, if you're thinking of going after her, take my advice. Don't. Not worth your life." Jackson didn't respond. His attention was drawn to the comms device again as it vibrated softly against his wrist. Another message. He tapped it open, his heart pounding despite himself. "Come to docking bay 12. Time is running out." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. Jackson glanced around the cantina, his senses sharpening. No one seemed to be watching him, but that didn't mean he wasn't being watched. He stood, slipping a few credits onto the table. The bartender raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as Jackson strode toward the exit. The station's corridors were dimly lit, the walls lined with flickering panels and maintenance drones that scurried about like metallic insects. Docking Bay 12 wasn't far, but the message's urgency set his pulse racing. When he arrived, the bay was eerily quiet. A single ship sat in the center, a sleek black vessel with no markings, its surface absorbing the dim light like a shadow come to life. Jackson approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the blaster at his hip. The ship's ramp lowered with a hiss, revealing a figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the interior. A woman, cloaked and hooded, her features obscured, but her presence commanding. "You're late," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of impatience. Jackson stopped a few paces away, his hand still near his weapon. "Who are you?" The woman stepped forward, the dim light catching the edge of her face, a sharp jawline, a hint of silver eyes. She reached into her cloak and Jackson tensed, ready to draw, but instead of a weapon, she produced a small hollow disc, tossing it onto the ground between them. The disc flickered to life, projecting an image of a young woman in chains. Her hair, white as starlight, framed a face that was both regal and weary. Her eyes, vibrant green, stared out at him with a mix of defiance and desperation. "Princess Nyra," the cloaked woman said, her tone grave. "She's running out of time, and you're the only one who can save her." Jackson's gaze lingered on the image, a million questions racing through his mind, but only one made it to his lips. "Why me?" The woman's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Because you owe her, even if you don't remember it yet." Before Jackson could respond, the ship's engines roared to life, and the woman retreated into the shadows. "Wait!" he called out, but the ramp was already closing. The hollow disc remained at his feet, its image flickering like a ghost. Jackson picked it up, staring at the princess's face as the ship disappeared into the void. And for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost: purpose. The stars outside flickered like distant dying embers, their cold light illuminating the narrow corridor of Jackson's ship. His fingers tapped an erratic rhythm against the console as the vessel hummed through the quiet vastness of space. The hollow disc from Docking Bay 12 lay in front of him, still projecting the image of Princess Nyra, frozen in chains, her emerald eyes wide with silent plea. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that everything about this mission reeked of danger. But then again, when had he ever steered clear of that? His life had been built on the fringes of law, a long list of enemies chasing the ghost of his past. Every bounty, every run, every job had come with the same warning: don't look too closely, don't ask too many questions. He'd learned the hard way what happened when you ignored that rule. But this felt different. The princess's eyes, those intense alien eyes, seemed to peer into him, stripping him of his defenses. He tried to push it away, telling himself he wasn't the hero type, but deep down, something inside him was stirring. He hadn't been able to ignore that feeling in years, but this time, it wasn't just about the credits. Jackson turned away from the console, his booted feet heavy against the ship's metal floor. The silence was almost unbearable. He couldn't help but think about what lay ahead. The Ravage Collective was no small threat, and they had a fortress that would make even the most hardened mercenary hesitate. They were known for their brutality. No one had ever infiltrated their strongholds and lived to tell the tale. And yet, here Jackson was, preparing to walk straight into the lion's den. His hand hovered over the comms, debating. The message from the cloaked woman lingered in his mind, the cryptic words echoing like a drumbeat. "Because you owe her, even if you don't remember it yet." What did that mean? What kind of debt could he possibly owe to a woman he'd never met? And if he didn't know her, how could he trust anything she'd said? His eyes flicked over to the small map of the galaxy displayed on the navigation screen. He was heading toward Viridian space, a sector known for its ancient ruins, fading empires, and dangerous factions. The Ravage Collective had grown bolder in recent years, spreading their influence, eradicating opposition with relentless efficiency. They had no mercy. And yet, here he was, preparing to face them, not for glory, not for fame, but for a princess he didn't even know. Jackson's fingers curled into a fist. The hum of the ship's engine seemed to slow down, every pulse of the machinery sending vibrations through the hull, and for a moment, it felt as though the whole universe had paused. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The kind of presence that made his skin crawl, like the shadows were closing in, creeping toward him with a quiet inevitability. He tried to shake it off, refocusing on the mission at hand. He had a job to do, and nothing would distract him from that. Not anymore. But the call to Docking Bay 12 had stirred something in him, something deep and primal. He had a habit of ignoring those feelings, but this time, there was no turning back. The comms device beeped again, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through his thoughts. This time there was a new message, short, urgent. Ravage Collective knows you're coming. You're already a target. A cold rush of adrenaline surged through him as he read the words. They were already onto him. His instincts flared. He wasn't ready. No one could be ready for a situation like this. The Ravage Collective was everywhere. Spies, infiltrators, their influence spreading like poison through the galaxy. If they knew he was coming, there was no way he'd make it to the princess unnoticed. His heart rate quickened as he shifted in his seat, his eyes darting across the ship's interior. He checked the controls again. Everything was functional, but he needed more information. Who had sent the message? How did they know? Before he could contemplate further, the ship lurched violently. His stomach dropped as the sudden turbulence rattled the hull. For a moment, Jackson lost his grip on the console, the dim lights flickering in rhythm with the alarms blaring across the ship's intercom. "Shit," he muttered, bracing himself against the sudden shift. The ship was being pulled out of its course, something grabbing it with unnatural force. He scrambled for the manual override, his mind racing. They were here, the Ravage Collective. They had tracked him down faster than he'd anticipated. Jackson slammed his palm down on the comms button, sending a distress signal out on all frequencies. "This is Jackson Drake. I'm under attack. Can anyone—" The rest of his transmission was drowned out by the blaring screech of interference. He had no time to finish the message. The ship groaned as it buckled under the strain of the invisible force, pulling it deeper into the darkness. A dark silhouette emerged from the depths of space. Another ship, black as pitch, its hull sleek and menacing. The Ravage Collective's flagship. Jackson's breath hitched as his hands tightened on the controls. His mind raced. There was no way he could outrun them now. His only option was to fight. He gripped his blaster, his heart hammering in his chest as the intruder ship came into view. Weapons locked, shields down. "Shit," he muttered, but there was no fear. He'd been in worse situations, had fought his way out of them before. He wasn't about to die today, not without knowing who the hell was behind this mess. With a series of swift, practiced motions, Jackson toggled the ship's defense systems, activating the automated countermeasures. But it was a short-lived advantage. The enemy ship fired first, a barrage of energy blasts crackling through the void, striking his vessel with the force of thunder. The ship rocked violently, alarms blaring in his ears as sparks erupted from the console. He cursed under his breath, shifting into evasive maneuvers, but the Ravage ship was relentless, closing the gap with terrifying precision. This is it. Jackson's mind raced. There was only one option left. He had to get to the princess. And that meant surviving this fight. He wasn't going to let them take him without a fight. Not when the stakes were this high. The countdown began in his head, the seconds ticking away with each explosive impact that rattled the hull. His hand hovered over the weapon systems, ready to unleash everything he had. The tension in his body coiled tight, and the weight of his decisions bore down on him. But even as he prepared for the inevitable clash, a single thought echoed in his mind. Who else was hunting the princess? The deafening roar of the Ravage Collective's flagship reverberated through Jackson's ship as it shuddered under the assault. Sparks flew from the console, the entire ship lurching with each impact, threatening to tear apart the fragile hull. His hands flew over the controls, desperately trying to stabilize the ship, but the constant barrage of energy blasts made it feel like he was merely spinning his wheels in the void. The stench of burning metal and electrical overload filled the air, thick and acrid, but Jackson's focus was razor-sharp. His pulse drummed in his ears as he worked the manual overrides, trying to regain control of the ship's trajectory. His breath came in harsh gasps, adrenaline flooding his system. He was no stranger to combat, but this felt different. His instincts screamed at him that something more than just a typical firefight was at play. The Ravage Collective was relentless, but something else was there, something that was watching, waiting. A flash of light, bright, searing, flared on his right as another shot from the enemy ship broke through his defenses, cutting through the ship's left wing and causing an eruption of sparks. The lights flickered, and Jackson's hand tightened around the controls, cursing under his breath. He had seconds before his ship would be reduced to scrap. Come on, he muttered, slamming his fist on the comms panel. Naira, get ready, we're going in. But there was no reply. The comms were dead, cut off by the damage. His heart skipped a beat. Where was she? He had to get to her. She was his ticket out of this mess. Through the battered viewport, Jackson caught sight of the massive enemy ship, looming like a dark leviathan against the void. It was no ordinary vessel. Sleek and ominous, its surface glowed with a faint, unnatural sheen, its sharp edges cutting into the starry sky like jagged teeth. The Ravage Collective was known for their experimental technology, but this was something new, something Jackson couldn't quite place. The ship seemed to pulse with an eerie energy that defied all logic. It wasn't just built for war, it was built for something else, something dangerous. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the static of his damaged comms. Jackson Drake. His blood ran cold at the sound, a chill crawling down his spine. The voice was low, almost guttural, but there was something unmistakably familiar about it, a voice he had never wanted to hear again. It was him. Still alive, I see. I was hoping you'd be, for old time's sake. Jackson's stomach twisted as the memories flooded back, memories he had buried, locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. The name, the voice, the face of the man who haunted him. Kairos Varn, former commander of the Viridian elite forces, a man who had orchestrated the fall of Jackson's former unit, betrayed them to the highest bidder. And now it seemed Kairos was at the helm of the Ravage Collective's war machine. Jackson's pulse quickened. He had known the collective had ties to the highest levels of power, but this was far worse than he'd anticipated. Kairos was not just an enemy from the past, he was the embodiment of everything Jackson had fought against. Betrayal. Kairos, Jackson spat, his voice a growl, every syllable laced with contempt. What do you want? The man's laugh echoed through the comms, dark and mocking. What do I want? I want you to understand, Jackson, that there is no escape. You're not the hero in this story. You never were. Before Jackson could respond, the ship jolted again, a massive blast from the Ravage flagship sending his vessel spiraling into an uncontrolled dive. His hands fought the controls as the horizon tilted sharply. He was losing it. He couldn't keep this up. The ship was going to break apart if he didn't act fast. Damn it, Jackson cursed, flicking switches and pulling levers with a frantic desperation. The ship groaned in protest, but he wasn't about to die here, not like this. A burst of light exploded just in front of him, blinding him for a moment. He shielded his eyes, but it was already too late. A low hum filled the ship, an energy wave that seemed to vibrate through every atom of his body. He wasn't sure what it was, but it felt as though the very fabric of space was bending, distorting around him. Before he could process what was happening, the force field around his ship flickered and faded, and the next moment, everything was still. The Ravage Collective ship had stopped firing, and the silence. Oh, the silence was worse than the noise. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. They echoed through the metal corridors of Jackson's ship, rhythmic like a pulse. His breath caught in his throat as he reached for his blaster, ready for the fight he knew was coming. But when the figure finally emerged into the flickering light, Jackson's heart stopped. It wasn't Kairos. It wasn't a soldier. It was her, Princess Naira. She stood before him, her eyes glowing in the dim light, her posture regal, despite the chains that bound her wrists. But it wasn't the chains that held his gaze. It was the energy, an aura, a crackling power that seemed to emanate from her very core. You're alive, Jackson breathed, disbelief mingling with a growing sense of awe. Naira's eyes met his, and for a moment, the universe seemed to still around them. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but there was something about it, something raw, dangerous, that sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. They think they've captured me, Jackson. They think they control me, but they don't. Not anymore. Jackson couldn't tear his eyes away from her. The air seemed to thrum with the power she exuded. But there was something else beneath the surface, a crack in her voice, a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. "What do you mean?" Jackson asked, taking a hesitant step toward her. She held up a hand, a flicker of energy crackling between her fingertips. "You don't understand. They knew I was dangerous, but they don't know the full extent of my power." Jackson's mind raced. Everything about this was wrong. The mission, the message, the woman standing before him, none of it made sense. What had she just said? They don't know the full extent of my power. Suddenly, it clicked. The Ravage Collective wasn't just after the princess for her political value. They weren't just after her for leverage, they were after something far darker. Jackson's hand tightened around his blaster. "What are you really, Naira?" Her eyes flashed with something ancient, something terrifying. "I'm the key, Jackson. The key to everything. The universe is about to change, and I was never meant to be a prisoner." And just like that, the gravity of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The princess wasn't just a political pawn in the hands of the Ravage Collective. She was the weapon, and Jackson was tangled up in something much bigger than he'd ever signed up for. Jackson's mind raced, trying to piece together the chaos that had unfolded in mere minutes. Naira, her once pristine appearance, was now marred by the dirt and grime of her captivity. But there was no mistaking the power that radiated from her, that strange energy he could feel in his bones. She had said she was the key, the answer to something vast and dark. But what did that mean? What kind of power could a single person, let alone someone like her, hold over the fate of the universe? He forced his gaze away from Naira's glowing eyes, pulling himself back from the temptation to simply lose himself in the strange allure of her presence. There was no time for this. The Ravage Collective wasn't just after her for her beauty or her political status. They were hunting something far more dangerous, something that Jackson couldn't yet comprehend. The ship shook again, more violently this time, jolting Jackson from his thoughts. Alarms blared across the cockpit, and a flickering red light illuminated the dim space. His fingers moved over the controls with practiced ease, but there was no denying that they were running out of time. If the Collective's ship was closing in, he had no choice but to act now. "Naira, we need to get out of here," Jackson said, his voice low but urgent. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Her lips parted, and for a moment Jackson thought she might say something that would finally unravel the mystery that surrounded her. But she said nothing. Instead, she raised her hand, her fingers crackling with a dark electric energy. A shudder ran through the ship, and the walls groaned as if they were bending under an unseen weight. The humming sound, distant at first, now seemed to come from everywhere, from within the very bones of the ship itself. Jackson's chest tightened as he watched Naira concentrate. He didn't know if he should trust her, didn't know if he could even begin to comprehend what she was doing. But there was something irresistible about her command of the situation. Her power was raw, unrefined, and yet it felt as though it could shatter the universe if she so willed it. "We're running out of time," Jackson said, a deep urgency creeping into his voice. Finally, Naira looked up at him, her eyes sharp and piercing, almost as if she had been waiting for him to speak. "I know," she said softly. "But you don't understand. The power within me, it's not just about escaping the Collective. It's about changing the rules of the game entirely." Jackson's pulse quickened as her words settled in. His breath caught in his throat. Changing the rules of the game. He had seen what the collective could do. He had felt the weight of their ruthless pursuit, the lengths they would go to in order to capture her. But what Naira was suggesting was something else entirely. Was she planning to fight back? Or was there something darker at play? Something even worse than the Ravage Collective could offer? "I'm not sure I understand," Jackson said slowly, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and fear. Naira's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was a sad smile, one that carried the weight of ancient knowledge. "You don't have to understand everything," she said, her voice distant as though she were speaking to herself. "You just need to trust me. Trust that I can help us survive this. Trust that I can protect us." Jackson's throat tightened, the words catching in his chest. He had spent years battling enemies, dodging death at every turn, but trusting someone like Naira, someone who was wrapped in this mysterious, terrifying energy, was something he wasn't sure he was ready for. And yet, he could feel the pull, the magnetic force that seemed to draw him toward her. Another tremor ran through the ship, and Jackson's focus snapped back to the controls. The collective ship was closing in faster than he anticipated. They didn't have much longer. He looked over at Naira once more, her eyes alight with something he couldn't quite place. The words from earlier hung in the air, unanswered. "I am the key." To what? His instinct screamed at him to get away, to leave her behind, but something in her presence, something in her eyes, made him hesitate. He couldn't do it. With a deep, steadying breath, Jackson turned back to the controls. "All right," he said, his voice gruff, "but we're going to need a plan. I'm not throwing my life away on some gamble." Naira nodded, a glimmer of something sharp and calculating flickering in her gaze. She reached forward, placing a hand over his. The contact sent a shudder of energy through him, a wave of warmth and cold that flooded his veins and left his head spinning. "Do you trust me now?" she asked quietly, her breath a whisper against his skin. Jackson's heart beat erratically, but he kept his face neutral. This was it. The moment where everything changed. The moment where the mystery of her power could either be their salvation or their doom. He had no choice but to trust her, to place his faith in the unknown. "I don't know if I trust you," Jackson said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm with you. We'll figure this out together." Her lips curved into a smile that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. "That's all I need." With a sudden surge of energy, the ship lurched forward, and Jackson's heart raced as Naira activated a surge of power that threw them into hyperdrive. The collective ship's pursuit was now a mere shadow in their wake, but Jackson knew this was far from over. The sound of Naira's voice, soft but resolute, filtered through the comms. "We're not safe, Jackson. Not yet, but we have to go deeper into the dark, deeper into the heart of the galaxy. Only then will we uncover the truth of what's really at stake." Her words echoed in his mind as the ship raced faster than he could track, tearing through the fabric of space itself. The dark abyss was calling, and for the first time, Jackson felt that he was not just running from his past. He was running toward something far more dangerous, something that held the answers to the questions he hadn't even known to ask. And the truth, he realized with a shiver, was far more terrifying than he had imagined. Jackson stood on the edge of the cliff, staring into the abyss. The wind howled through the jagged rocks, its cold bite cutting through the silence that had settled over them. His boots dug into the earth, the ground beneath him trembling with an energy he could feel deep in his bones. He could feel it now. The truth. It wasn't the ships chasing them, nor the galaxy's fractured politics, that truly threatened them. It was the thing they'd uncovered, the darkness they had unearthed in their flight, the truth that bound Naira to everything they had fought for. The quiet hum of the ship's engines idled in the background, a constant reminder of how far they had come, how much they had endured to reach this moment. Behind him, the ship had been set into orbit around a planet that should not have existed, hidden in the folds of space, like a secret long buried by time itself, a place that defied logic, a place where Naira's power pulsed like a heartbeat, as if it had always belonged there. She stood beside him now, her hand resting gently on the control panel of the ship, her gaze far off, distant. Her aura, a whisper of light, a shimmer that was no longer hidden, was now undeniable, more intense than ever. But it wasn't just her power. It was something deeper, something ancient. Jackson finally spoke, his voice breaking the heavy silence that had grown between them. "Is this it? This is the place you've been hiding from? The place where everything began?" Naira's eyes met his, calm yet haunted, a lifetime of truths dancing in their depths. She didn't need to answer him with words. There was a quiet, understanding nod, a flicker of regret. "Yes," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it all began. This is where everything ends." The words sent a chill through Jackson, but he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He had fought alongside her for so long, had trusted her with his life. And yet, the weight of her words was heavy, laden with meaning he had only begun to understand. Naira turned toward him, her gaze shifting between the horizon and his face. "I was not just the Princess of Viridia, Jackson. I was something more, something much older. The key to the very force that controls this galaxy, the force they all feared. I was created to wield it, to control it." She closed her eyes, the weight of her confession hanging in the air like a dense fog. "But I couldn't. I couldn't control it. And now I have to destroy it before it destroys everything." Jackson's heart hammered in his chest. You are the weapon they've been hunting all along?" "Yes," she said, her voice full of both sorrow and acceptance. "And now, it's my burden to bear." Her eyes met his again, and there was a depth of emotion there, a mixture of fear and trust, vulnerability and resolve. "But I cannot do this alone. Not anymore. I need you, Jackson." His thoughts tumbled over one another. The weight of the moment was too much to take in all at once. The galaxy's destruction had always been an abstract concept to him, an idea pushed on the fringes of his understanding. But now, with Naira standing before him, it felt too real, too tangible. Her power, the force she carried within her, had always been the center of his confusion. It was now the center of their fight. And yet, even with this terrifying knowledge, Jackson knew what he had to do. He had come this far, had made sacrifices beyond count, and he wasn't about to stop now. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady, though a trace of uncertainty lingered at the edge of his words. Naira turned away, moving to the edge of the precipice, looking down at the planet below. The surface was scarred, fractured, like a wound in the universe itself. The power, Jackson realized, was not just within Naira. It was connected to the planet, to the very fabric of existence, and that, he thought, was why it was so dangerous. "The only way to stop this," Naira said, almost to herself, "is to sever the connection, to destroy the power at its core." The Ravage Collective knew that. They weren't hunting me. They were hunting what I can unlock. Jackson stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath his feet. "And how do we destroy it?" "I can't do it alone," Naira whispered, turning back to face him. "You've been my anchor, Jackson, the only thing that's kept me grounded. If I can't destroy it with my power, then maybe we can destroy it together." There it was again, the unspoken bond between them. They had been through too much, fought too many battles, and shared too many quiet moments in the shadow of war for Jackson to ever walk away now. He had to trust her. He had to trust that this was the right path. "Then let's do it," he said, his voice raw with determination. "Let's end it." Together, they descended into the heart of the planet's surface. The tunnels that led to the core were long and winding, the air thick with the hum of energy, almost alive. As they moved deeper, Jackson could feel the power growing stronger, pressing against his chest like an oppressive weight. Naira's presence beside him only added to the tension, her aura shimmering faintly as she led the way. Finally, they reached the core, a massive crystalline structure pulsing with an eerie glow. The energy within it was overwhelming, an ancient force that seemed to resonate with Naira's own power. The Ravage Collective had been right to fear it. And yet, Jackson realized, it wasn't just about destroying the force. It was about saving Naira, saving her from becoming a weapon she could never control. Naira stood before the crystal, her hands raised, her expression one of intense concentration. The energy around her crackled and shifted, responding to her call. She was going to destroy it, but at what cost? Jackson took a step forward, his hand reaching for hers. "I'm with you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We do this together." A faint smile tugged at Naira's lips. For the first time in a long while, she looked at peace. The final piece of her puzzle had clicked into place. With a surge of power, the crystal shattered. Light exploded, flooding the chamber with a brilliant, blinding brilliance. Jackson's heart pounded as the world seemed to collapse around him, but in the center of the chaos, there was Naira, her eyes alight with the energy she had unleashed. When the light finally faded and the dust settled, the silence was almost deafening. The power was gone. The connection severed. Naira collapsed into Jackson's arms, her energy finally spent. But there was no more fear in her eyes, only peace and love. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jackson held her tightly, his heart swelling with relief and something more. It was over. They had saved the galaxy, but at what cost? The two of them stood together, the weight of the universe in their hands, knowing that while they had destroyed one power, they had created something new, something even more powerful than what had come before. Together they had found their redemption, and together they would face whatever came next.